All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started on this review. Today we're looking at neuroscience or biological psychology. And as you know, this is the perspective that looks at how our actions or our thoughts are influenced by our physical being, whether it's our biochemical makeup, whether it's part of the brain, whether it's a genetic predisposition. How is our behavior and our thoughts linked to our physical being, our biological makeup, or our physiology? So the focus in this chapter is actually the nervous system. So the nervous system is what is responsible for getting all of the information from the outside world and transferring it up to our brain for translation and interpretation. And the main unit of the nervous system that is responsible for getting that information up to the brain is the neuron or nerve cell. So the nerve cell is going to pick up the information from your senses, whether it's something you see, hear, taste, touch, or smell. So the sensory neuron is going to pick up that information, transfer it like a relay race, because remember, nerve cells do not touch. They have a gap between them. So the electrical zap will cross the gap where the synapse, transfer into the adjacent nerve cell, and the process continues until that information gets to your brain. And then you translate it, and then the motor neurons will bring that information back out, and you will react based on your interpretation. So you will need to know the main components or parts of the nerve cell. So let's go over those first. All right, first of all, the dendrites, that is the input structure. So the dendrites are responsible for picking up the information from the senses or the neighboring neuron and bringing it into the cell. And you can see these dendrites are the branches. So once the impulse is picked up by the dendrites, they will travel to the central portion of the cell called the cell body or soma. So the cell body or soma contains the most important part of the nerve cell, and that is the nucleus. Why is that so small? Geesh, that's very small. So it contains the nucleus. The nucleus has the job of determining whether or not to send the impulse along down the axon. So an example of where a impulse would not be sent would be because it did not reach a certain intensity, and we call that the threshold. So I gave the example in class. Let's say a fly lands on your shoulder and you don't ever notice it. Well, when the fly landed, sensory neurons were activated and that information started to be sent. But because a fly is so light, it did not meet the intensity or threshold, so it would just stop. So that's a case where it wouldn't continue on. So that is the job of the nucleus, is to determine whether or not to send the impulse. So if it meets the threshold or intensity, it will then travel down the axon. Okay, the axon is the output structure. As the electrical impulse travels down the axon, you can see that there's positive there's a negative, I was reading something. There's negative ions inside and positive out. Okay, so at first that would mean it's resting. Nothing is taking place. Once the impulse starts traveling down the axon, then you have a rush of those positive ions flowing in, and like a domino effect, they sweep across down to the bottom portion, which is the axon terminal. So this is the output structure, the axon. And axons can vary in length. The ones in the thoracic area are going be very, very tiny, whereas ones in your leg can be up to about 3 feet in length. So it just depends on where they're located in the body. The last stop is the axon terminal. And this is where the impulse will wait until it's sent across the gap or the synapse to the neighboring neuron, picked up by the dendrite, and the process starts all over again until that information gets to the brain. All right, so some of the axons, not all of them, but some of them have a little protective lining around them, and this is the myelin sheath. Okay, so this is a fatty protector that insulates the axon. If the axon is myelinated, the impulse will travel faster. So this increases the speed. As you get older, the myelin sheath just naturally breaks down. So obviously impulses aren't traveling through the body as fast. So reaction time decreases. So if I took a test which involved some type of reaction, and it was timed, you all would beat me hands down. I could not keep up because of the breakdown of the myelin sheath as we age. All right, so those are all of the different parts of the neuron. Before I move on, I'm going to type in here. You need to know what a glial cell is. Glial cell. G-L-I-A-L, glial. A glial cell is a cell that's in the body that nourishes a neuron. So it provides nourishment. It kind of repairs it. We didn't talk about that, and that's really all that's mentioned in the text. They really don't elaborate on any other function of the glial cells. But I do want to put that out there in case you see it. All right, again, the dendrites pick up the impulse, travels to the soma or cell body. The nucleus said, yep, this meets the threshold. It's sent down the axon. And in this case, this axon is myelinated, so the impulse will travel faster, and then it will stop in the axon terminal here and wait to be sent on to the next dendrite. All right, if the nerve cell is active, we say the action potential is occurring, and that just simply means that it's active. It's depolarized. Okay, those positive ions are rushing in and traveling down the axon. So the action potential is occurring. Not all axons or nerve cells are active at any given time. Some are just resting or polarized and just hanging out waiting. All right, so that's the action potential. As I said, resting, positive ions outside, negative inside. If it's depolarized, they rush in and they swoop down like a domino effect, getting all the way down to the axon terminal. All right, the all or none response. So just like a gun, an impulse will either be sent or it won't. It either fires or it doesn't. It just cannot get partway down the axon and stop. And again, it has to meet that certain threshold in order to be sent. All right, so the next thing we're going to look at is how the nerve cells communicate with one another. How does the impulse get across the gap or the synapse? Right, so the synapse is that tiny gap that you can see here between the nerve cells. Okay, so this is an axon terminal enlarged, that last stop, and this would be a dendrite of an adjacent or neighboring neuron. So how does that information cross that gap? Well, as the impulse comes down into the axon terminal here, you can see these large sacs, and they're called synaptic vesicles. So when the impulse comes down, it's an electrical zap, okay, that pushes those synaptic vesicles down to the synapse. And then inside of them, this is the key. Inside, we have what are called neurotransmitters, which are the chemical messengers that come out of the synaptic vesicles, and you can see they cross the synapse or the gap, connect to a receptor or binding site. They open up a channel, and then the impulse passes through. So the neurotransmitters are the messengers. They are what is responsible for transferring information from one nerve cell to the other. These nerve cells fit like a lock and a key. So they connect to a binding site, but they have, I mean, they look very, very similar. Even on a microscope, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. But they are specific to certain binding sites. And when they connect and they open up, the impulse, you can see, will travel through the ions. So I gave you the example, like my key looks exactly like Mr. Shipe's key. I can't tell the difference, but my key only opens my door. I can't open his, and he can't open mine. And that's the same principle behind the neurotransmitters. And here you can see this is a neurotransmitter that fits perfectly on the receptor site. All right, so that's neural communication. I'll go over that one more time. So impulse is picked up by the dendrites. It then travels to the soma or cell body. The nucleus says, yes, this meets a certain intensity or threshold. And then the impulse is sent down the axon. If it's myelinated, it'll travel faster. If it is traveling down the axon, the action potential is occurring and it's depolarized. Then the impulse will stop in the axon terminal. So here is an axon terminal enlarged. So the impulse comes down into the axon terminal. It will zap the synaptic vesicles, sending those down to the membrane or the synapse. The neurotransmitters inside, as you can see here, synaptic vesicle over here. The neurotransmitters inside will cross the gap or the synapse, connect to a binding site. The channel will open up and the impulse is sent, starts all the way back over with the next dendrite. All right, so the next term, sometimes there will be an excess of neurotransmitters floating around in the synapse, and you don't want that. We talked about the fact that neurotransmitters, if you have too many or too few, can alter our behavior and our thoughts. So what happens is that sending axon terminal takes them back in, re-uptakes them or reabsorbs them. All right, so let's look at a few specific neurotransmitters. Again, neurotransmitters are the chemical messengers that relay the information from one nerve cell to the other. So they also can alter certain thoughts or bodily processes that we have. We want a good balance. Again, too many or too few can alter those. There are over a dozen that have been identified. We have more, but they still haven't been identified, or neuroscientists haven't figured out the purpose of those yet. You only have to know 5 of them for this class, though. So we'll look at the first one that they discovered, and that's acetylcholine. Sometimes that's referred to as ACH. The most common question on the AP test, there'll always be one of these neurotransmitters on there, but they usually associate this with Alzheimer's because it involves memory. A lack of acetylcholine can be connected with memory loss or Alzheimer's disease. Black widow, I've seen that on there before. If you get bitten by a black widow, it floods the body with ACH and you'll have uncontrollable motor movements. Botulinum poison can actually completely block ACH and completely paralyze you. So it has the opposite effect with motor movement. Sometimes improperly canned food can contain that poison. So if you see dents, don't ever buy a can. All right, the second is serotonin, and think Sarah is sad. This is usually associated with depression. A lack of serotonin leads to depression. And that's a very common question on the AP test. All right, dopamine. Dopamine involves motor movement. and attention or alertness or focus. So first of all, motor movement. A lot of people with Parkinson's lack dopamine. And we talked about the fact that there are a lot of drugs available that mimic or decrease these neurotransmitters in the body to help us regulate them to a normal. And Parkinson's, you would have like L-Dopa is one example of a drug that will increase dopamine in the body to help prevent those uncontrollable motor movements. So looking at attention and alertness, we'll be talking about schizophrenia this week in class. So with schizophrenia, they have an excess of dopamine in the body. So that's kind of sending senses into overdrive, and it causes them to hallucinate. And they see and hear things that none of us do. But there are antipsychotic drugs that decrease the dopamine levels in the brain of a schizophrenia and cause the hallucinations to go away. One would be Thorazine and the other would be Haldol. All right, endorphins. Endorphins are your body's natural painkillers. So they're released when we're experiencing minor pain. So like a paper cut, or you may burn your tongue eating hot wings or something like that. Endorphins are released and they kind of alleviate that, or your shoes are too tight. Any opiate that you would take would increase the endorphins in the body. Any type of pain medicine will increase endorphins in the body to some extent. Endorphins are also released in extreme exercise. So like you've heard of a runner's high. So you're on like mile 23 of a marathon and you feel exhausted, and then you get like a second wind, and that's the endorphins kicking in. The reason why pain medicine is so addictive is because whenever you chronically use any pain medicine, your body stops producing endorphins. So when you stop using the pain medicine and your body's not producing endorphins, you feel miserable. And that's why a lot of people can't stop, because they just feel so bad that they have to take more pain medicine to feel better. Eventually the body will start producing endorphins again, but it's a long process. All right, the last neurotransmitter will be epinephrine. All right, epinephrine deals with alertness, arousal, energy. Think of an adrenaline rush. Epinephrine has the exact same effect as adrenaline. So that would be an increase in any type of energy. So epinephrine is released whenever you're under stress. Anytime the sympathetic nervous system is activated, when you're nervous, when you're really happy, any heightened emotional state, epinephrine is released and you have that increase in energy. A lack of epinephrine is associated with ADD because epinephrine deals with our ability to focus or remain alert. So a lot of people who have ADD, attention deficit disorder, they take like Ritalin or Adderall, and that increases the epinephrine in the body, a small dose, to help people focus. Cocaine is a drug that floods the body with epinephrine, basically giving someone a lot of energy, a lot of focus and alertness. So that's a very high concentration of epinephrine compared to like Ritalin or Adderall. All right, so that finishes off all of the neurotransmitters. Now I mentioned drugs. There are two categories of drugs. Okay, there we go. Two categories of drugs, agonists and antagonists. So an agonist is a drug that mimics or looks very similar and increases the neurotransmitters in the body. So, for example, serotonin. People who lack serotonin are depressed, so they take antidepressants like Paxil, Prozac, or Zoloft, or very common ones, and that increases the serotonin levels in the body to make people feel better. All right, so antagonist will decrease neurotransmitters. So that would be like in the case of schizophrenia. They have an excess of dopamine, so you want to decrease that. So Haldol or Thorazine would lower the dopamine levels, causing the heightened sense of alertness to go away, causing the hallucinations and delusions to stop. All right, next thing we looked at are 3 different types of neurons. So first of all, the sensory neuron. They're the neurons that pick up the information from the outside world, and they carry that information up to the brain. So they're picking it up from your senses. So everything you see, hear, taste, touch, and smell will be picked up by a sensory neuron, and that is transferred up to the brain via the process of that relay race. They used to be called afferent neurons. Once that information gets to the brain, you interpret it, you perceive it, you translate it. You just heard a song, you translate it. Do you like it or not? So then after you interpret that information comes back out to the body and you react. And that's through motor neurons, because oftentimes it causes you to motor or move. So you hear a song, that information gets up to the brain and you're like, oh, I like that. So motor neurons come back out and you turn it up. An interneuron will connect sensory and motor neurons. And this occurs in the spine. And this involves a reflex. You think about it, the doctor hits your knee to test your reflexes. Your knee just jerks automatically. That motor neuron fires when the doctor hits your knee. That goes to the spine. An interneuron connects that to a motor neuron back out, and your knee moves automatically. Okay, it doesn't go to the brain. So it bypasses the brain. That's why it happens so fast. A reflex is an automatic reaction. So it just goes to the spine, doesn't have to take the time for that translation and information to get to the brain. So you always want to connect an interneuron with the spine. It'll usually be associated with spine, spinal cord, or a reflex. All right, so the next thing we looked at, oh, great, I forgot this is on here, so, okay. This isn't all gonna be written down. I forgot you can't get rid of these boxes on Schoology, but, so we looked at the different parts of the nervous system, and I think this is one of the areas in this unit that a lot of people struggle with. So let's look at the 2 main divisions. I like this hierarchy chart. I think it makes it easy if you're going from very broad down to specific. All right, so the central nervous system is the easiest. So the central nervous system consists of 2 things, and that is the brain and the spine. So they're in the center of the body, and that's why they're called the central nervous system. And sometimes you'll see that abbreviated CNS. The PNS, or the peripheral nervous system, is a little bit more complicated. So let's look at the one here on the right side. It just stops. That would be your somatic division of the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is everything outside of the body other than the brain and the spine. So you're looking at your glands and hormones and organs and such. So the somatic nervous system is the part that controls your voluntary movements, your skeletal muscles, things that you willfully do, like get up out of your chair and go get something to eat out of the fridge. That involves your muscles. You're doing that voluntarily. The autonomic nervous system here is the second part. And think of autonomic as automatic. These are the things that take place inside of your body automatically without you knowing. So this would be involving your organs, such as heartbeat or breathing or digestion. You don't have to say, okay, please digest my food right now. It just automatically occurs. So we have, to make it interesting, 2 different divisions of the autonomic nervous system. So one of them would occur whenever we're in a tense situation, an emotional state, we're under stress. And this is an increase in all of those automatic processes. And this is the sympathetic nervous system. So think about being in danger. So you're walking along and you're out in the woods. I gave you an example, and you hear like a rustling of the leaves and you think, oh no, it might be a bear or something. So what's going to happen? Your heart rate goes up, your breathing increases, you start to perspire. Glucose goes to your muscles to give you energy and strength. And there's an increase in epinephrine, and you have a heightened state, an adrenaline, a heightened state of arousal. And this is what we call your fight or flight response. Okay, everything increases, pupils dilate, with the exception of two things. One, your saliva decreases. And you may notice that if you've ever been nervous and you had to get up and give a speech, everything's increasing. Your heart rate's up, you're sweaty. You can feel your heart just racing, your breathing increases, but you have dry mouth. So you might have to have water or something. And that's because saliva decreases, but also digestion slows. And like I said, that's good. You don't want to have to stop and go to the bathroom if you're being chased by a bear. So after you're removed from that intense situation, then the parasympathetic nervous system kicks in. So that would be the other part down here. And the parasympathetic nervous system returns you to normal. Everything slows back down. So heart rate, breathing will start to decrease. The perspiration goes away, and the pupils return to normal. All right, so that brings us to the different parts of the brain. I'm going to take a break here and fill up my coffee cup. So just give me a second. All right, got my coffee cup filled. Yes, I drink coffee all day long. Probably shouldn't. All right, so the different divisions, we have 3 divisions of the brain. First of all, the hindbrain. This is the brain stem, also called the old brain, because if you believe in evolution, it would have been the first part of the brain to evolve. This is the only part of the brain you cannot live without because, in general, this controls your vital functions, okay, that sustain your life, such as heartbeat. The midbrain, very small portion you see in green there, or sometimes called the limbic system. That is basically your emotional or memory center. It's usually on the AP test connected to emotion. The top, the largest portion of the brain, is the gray matter that if you looked at a model you would see, is called either the forebrain, cerebrum, or cerebral cortex. And this is for our higher cognitive functions. Also called the new brain because it would have been the last part of the brain to evolve. Okay, so let's start off with the different parts of the hindbrain. First of all, the medulla. Medulla oblongata controls heartbeat and breathing, and it is at the very bottom of the brain stem that connects to the spinal cord. So damage to this region would impair your heartbeat and breathing. All right, so the thalamus sits below, or sits above, sorry, the hypothalamus. And this part of the brain is responsible for transmitting all of that information, all of those impulses to the correct locations in the forebrain or cerebral cortex. And I always say this is like the crystal of the brain, the sensory switchboard. So whenever Crystal receives a phone call in the office, she sends it to the person in the building that should take it. That's what the thalamus does. So if it receives an impulse from your eyes, something that you've seen, it's going to send that impulse to the back of the brain, the occipital lobe, where your visual cortex is located, for you to interpret. Now, this is true for every one of your senses except for smell. And it is kind of a mystery on why your impulses involving smell completely bypass the thalamus and go directly to the forebrain for translation. All right, the third part of the hindbrain is the reticular formation. This is a common question on the AP test involving arousal. And they often say if you're having trouble staying asleep or staying awake in class, which part of the brain is malfunctioning? And it would be the reticular formation. They talk about a cat, and I told you about the experiment where they discovered what the reticular formation did. If you electrically stimulate this area, it's like making it active. And when they do that in a cat's brain, it goes into an increase of energy for a long time period. It's very aroused. If they sever this in a cat's brain, it would slip into a coma and never be alert or aroused again. So sometimes the question on the AP test is connecting that example with the cat. The cerebellum. The cerebellum controls your movement and balance. So if this part of the brain was damaged, it'd be difficult for you to keep your balance or maintain movements. Sometimes it's called the little brain because it looks like a little miniature brain tucked up behind the brainstem. And when we looked at memory, we learned that the memories that involve movement are processed here as well. So that makes sense. Any skills that you've learned, riding a bike, tying a shoe, whatnot, will be processed here in the cerebellum. All right, the last part would be your pons. And this part of the brain deals with sleep and dreams, because we know when we're dreaming, your pons are very active. All of your senses are cut off. You're not seeing, hearing, tasting anything while you're sleeping. So you're not receiving any impulses to the forebrain, but the pons are very active and they're sending random impulses up, and your brain does its job. It tries to make sense of them and thus becomes our dream. And that's why a lot of our dreams are very bizarre or unusual, because they're just random impulses. This area of the brain also has a small portion that deals with facial recognition. And if it's damaged, people cannot determine faces. They cannot tell someone's face. They have to identify people by voice recognition. And this also helps, along with the cerebellum, it coordinates movements. So they communicate back and forth. All right, so the midbrain or the limbic system, again, this is your emotional center, but also for memory. All right, first of all, the amygdala. Remember, Amy is angry. This is your emotional center, but often is linked specifically to fear and anger. And they often refer to the different experiments on the AP test. So first of all, if you electrically stimulate a cat's brain, and you can see the cat here and the electrode on there, it's becoming active. They just get very, very angry and will attack anything that comes near it, and very uncharacteristic for most cats. So to test what would happen if you removed this part of the brain, they use rhesus monkeys. Rhesus monkeys are very violent monkeys. They even attack each other. They attack their young. When you remove this from their brain, they cower in fear. So anybody or anything that comes near them, they just run away. So that is how they discovered the link to anger and fear. All right, the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is below the thalamus, hypo. This controls everything hormonal. Very small part of the brain, but very important. So it controls everything hormonal because it tells the master gland, the pituitary gland, when to release hormones. So that's the control it has. So it controls everything hormonal. Thirst, our appetite. We talked about appetite hormones. Body temperature is due to hormones. So that's regulated by the hypothalamus. Your emotions, the release of our emotional hormones. It deals with sex drive, your sex hormones. Anything that has to do with any type of hormones, that is regulated by the hypothalamus. It also has a reward center. So there is a pleasure center in the brain, and they've identified it in animals, and it's very, very powerful. So the experiment that they do, they put a rat on this little platform, and then there's an electrified grid, which will shock it. I mean, really painful shock. And then there's a lever that they can push that will activate this reward center, pleasure center in the brain. Okay, so what they do is they've trained the rat. So the rat knows if they push this, they get that feel good feeling, basically. And they wanted to see if the rat would cross an electrified grid to feel that pleasure. And every rat that was put on that platform walked across that electrified grid that almost kills it so that they can push that lever. That may not be impressive, but those same rats, they put food on the other side, and the rats were starving, and they would not cross the electrified grid to eat, but all of them would to feel that pleasure. So they know it's very, very strong in animals. They haven't electrically stimulated found that necessarily in humans, but there is a lot of research that is trying to link that reward center of the hypothalamus to addiction, and that's ongoing. All right, so amygdala, hypothalamus, the third part of the limbic system is the hippocampus, and hippocampus deals directly with memory. So specifically, semantic memories, nothing to do with movement. So this would be memories of facts, dates, names, experiences that you've had in your life. And we'll touch more on that when we look at memory. All right, so that brings us to the forebrain, the cortex, or the cerebrum, whichever you prefer. And it has four main lobes on the left and four lobes on the right, which are attached by a band of nerve fibers, the corpus callosum, so they can communicate with one another. The left side controls the right side of the body. The right side controls the left. All right, so the cerebral cortex contains wrinkles or fissures. So what does that mean? It's like coiled, because if you stretched it out, it would be very, very long, but it's coiled and fits nice and tightly inside of your brain. It's like a ball of yarn. If you threw a ball of yarn and you unraveled it and laid it all out, it would look very long, but you can ball it all up and put it in the palm of your hand. Same principle behind the cerebral cortex. It's about the size of one of those big challenge pizzas that fat boys used to have if you unraveled it. All right, so let's look at the first lobe, the frontal lobe. Okay, that's up here in the front of the brain, obviously. This is the largest lobe, and this is responsible for judgment, abstract thought, planning, decision-making. This is your higher cognitive functions. And the larger the frontal lobe or association areas, which we'll get to, the smarter the animal species. So we have a very large frontal lobe compared to like a rat. This is very, very tiny, but obviously a rat doesn't have to plan where they're going on vacation or make decisions, complex decisions, or have any abstract thought. This also contains the motor cortex you see here in pink in the back. The motor cortex will be where all of our impulses dealing with movement occur. And scientists know exactly which area is involved with what body part. So if you electrically stimulate, let's say the area for your thumb, then your thumb will move. Okay, so this is where all of the movement impulses are processed. This area also contains the Broca area, and this is only in the left hemisphere. The Broca area controls the muscles in your mouth to allow you to speak. So if this was damaged, let's say you had a stroke or the swelling on the brain and this was damaged, you would lose the ability to speak. You could still understand what someone was saying, but you could not speak. Identified by Paul Broca, who was a physician dealing with stroke victims, and he recognized over and over again when people who had a stroke and this area was involved, they lost the ability to speak, so it was named after him. All right, the parietal lobe sits directly behind the frontal lobe, and it contains the sensory or the somatosensory cortex. So I'll show you that here in blue right there. Right behind the motor cortex. This is the parietal lobe back here. All right, so the sensory cortex, this is where all of your sensations are processed. And again, scientists have studied and know which part of the body the sensory cortex corresponds to. So if you electrically stimulate for your thumb, you'll feel like somebody is touching your thumb. You'll feel a sensation. This part of the brain also involves spatial reasoning or perception, and mathematical or logical thought also. Occipital lobe, this is in the back of the brain and controls vision. That's up back here. So this would be back here in the visual cortex, would be where you process everything that you see. And then the temporal lobe, let me show you that. That's here on the side, right here. The temporal lobe is right beside your ears. So that makes sense. This is where you process sound in the auditory cortex. This area also deals with facial recognition. And if this area of the brain is damaged, just like the pons, people lose the ability to recognize people's faces. This area of the brain also contains what's called the Wernicke. Carl Wernicke came up with this, the Wernicke area. And this allows us to understand what someone is saying. Understanding language. You can speak, but you cannot understand what anyone is saying. It would sound like everybody is speaking a foreign language that you've never heard of before. Again, named after a physician who was dealing with stroke victims and recognized when this area of the brain was damaged that people lost that ability. All right, so we looked at the Broca and the Wernicke. Aphasia is a term you need to know. This is any impairment to language. Now, usually one of these three terms will be on the AP test. Again, they always switch them up. I know the next term will be on the test. Association areas is usually always on every past test that I've read. So this is all of the area that you see in gray. Okay. The pink and the blue that you see, that is where that is involving sensory or motor functioning. So the sensory cortex, the motor cortex, the temporal or the auditory cortex and the temporal lobe, and the visual cortex and the occipital lobe. Other than that, this is where we process higher cognitive tasks, logical thought, spatial reasoning. We deal with decision-making, communication, mathematical equations, things of that nature. So association areas, again, the more association area, the more intelligent the species will be. Trying to think if there's anything else. Okay, and the left, there's always a question about either the left or the right hemisphere. So the left hemisphere controls language. The right hemisphere is exclusive to spatial reasoning and deals with like perception. So one of those are usually on there. All right, plasticity. If a nerve cell dies, it cannot be repaired or regenerated. But our brains do have the ability to compensate for that loss. So if, like I said before, if somebody had the left motor cortex damaged for their arm due to a stroke or something, swelling of the brain, encephalitis, something like that, they would lose the ability to move their right arm. But what happens is through training, such as physical therapy, working that over and over and over again, whether it's somebody doing it for you or you using the other arm to actually physically move that right arm, the nerve cells or the neurons around that damaged area will start to reconnect and make up for that loss. And in a best case scenario, you will gain mobility once again because of that. I think it's very interesting, I said before, because my daughter is a physical therapist, and that's the principle behind it, that plasticity. The younger you are, the more plastic your brain is. So the younger you are, the more likely you would be able to overcome that damage. But that's just pretty much with just about anything, not just with the brain. Right, and as I said, language is exclusive to the left. I forgot that was on here. And spatial reasoning on the right. All right, the corpus callosum is that big band of nerve fibers that connects the right and left hemispheres, allowing them to communicate with one another. In the 1960s, they started doing what's referred to as split brain research, where they severed the corpus callosum. And you would think, why would anybody do that? And this is before they had medication for seizures for epileptic patients. And what happens is, as someone starts having a seizure, that impulse starts in one hemisphere and travels to the other. Now, as it travels to the second hemisphere, it intensifies in length, so it gets longer, and it also gets stronger. So it gets longer and it's more painful. So people thought, or scientists thought, if you could cut the corpus callosum and keep that seizure activity in one hemisphere, perhaps that would help. So in the 1960s, there were people who volunteered to have this done, and they found that there was no real difference in their thought process. They could still perform every task that they did before. It's just like they had two separate brains. But after they started doing more research, the split brain research, they found out there was a difference. So if an image was flashed to the right eye only, that impulse was sent to the left hemisphere. Okay, so if the researcher said, what did you see? They could identify it because your language center is in the left. So if they say they saw a fork, that image went to the left brain and the left hemisphere, and they say, yep, I saw a fork. But what's interesting, if that image was flashed to the left eye and goes to the right hemisphere, it can't cross over to the left hemisphere because the corpus callosum is split. And so it can't get to your language center. So if they say, what did you see? They're like, I don't know. Now, they went further and they said, okay, we're going to send an image to your right eye. What did you see? And they say, okay, it goes to the left hemisphere. I saw a fork. Can you pick out the object with your hand, what you saw? And of course, they can pick a fork. When the image is flashed to the left eye, it goes to the right hemisphere, and they say, what did you see? And they say, I don't know, I didn't see anything. And they say, with your right hand, can you pick out, with your left hand, can you pick out what you saw? They can every time pick up the object, and they have no idea why. Like, I don't know why I know that. So anyway, it's because the sensory and the motor neurons are communicating. They just can't get to the left hemisphere to explain it. Very cool. Now, once they started making medicine for seizure activity, of course, the split brain procedure stopped. All right, we talked about the endocrine system. In upcoming chapters, we look at more of the hormones involved, but the endocrine system is your system of glands and hormones. Neurotransmitters are very, very fast. Hormones move very, very slow. We talked about how appetite hormones travel very slow in getting to the brain. So if you eat real fast, chances are you're going to overeat. All right, so we looked at different techniques to study the brain. So first of all, before we have modern tests, people just connected accidents or lesioning, which is removing or destroying brain tissue. So if somebody had an accident, they fell down and hit a part of their brain and started acting in a particular way, we say, oh, okay, this part of the brain is connected to this behavior, just through sheer accidents. And we talked about Phineas Gage, who had a tamping rod in the 1850s on a railroad site go up through his cheek and out the top of his brain. And it severed the limbic system from the frontal lobe. Now, in an average brain, these two are connected. So anytime you experience some emotion, which is your limbic system, those impulses communicate with the frontal lobe, which is your reasoning center for higher cognitive thought, and help you process your emotions. If they're severed, you'd be very impulsive, more like an animal. Animals have very weak connections between the two. So animals are more, they react on emotion instead of like calming down. Like if I'm angry with my boss for saying something to me, those impulses go to my frontal lobe and tell me, just calm down. Everything's going to be okay. Just ignore it. Because I don't want to scream back and then lose my job. So people, as you age, this actually gets stronger. This connection between the two parts of the brain, between the frontal lobe and the limbic system. So that's why a lot of times younger children are more impulsive, because of the weak connection between the two when we're young. All right, so a few modern techniques that we looked at. First of all, the EEG or electroencephalogram. This test records brain activity by looking at brain waves. So the leads on someone's scalp, they're put in certain places, like with this airplane glue, and you can record the different regions of the brain on a computer monitor, so you can see the different brainwave pattern, typically used today for sleep disorders, because we know that you go through many different brainwave patterns while you sleep. So if you're having difficulty sleeping, you have a sleep disorder, you would wear this when you go to sleep, and it could identify which particular brainwave or stage of sleep you're having problems with. We looked at CT scan, computer tomography. This is just taking a picture of the brain. So you could be looking at deformity. You could be looking at fluid on the brain. This is just a snapshot, a picture using x-rays. A more advanced but way more expensive image of the brain is the MRI scan. Okay, so this is computer generated, and it's a better test, but more expensive. So insurance companies prefer the CT first. But here you can see it's taking a picture. This is, let's see if I can enlarge that. Okay, this is showing you an increase in fluid in around the corpus callosum in someone's brain who has schizophrenia. That's one diagnostic tool that you can see. So that's one use of an MRI scan. But again, looking at structures, looking at fluid on the brain. All right, PET scans measure glucose in the body, because you're looking at activity here. When parts of the brain are active, glucose flows to that area. So if you see on a computer screen, it like illuminates certain areas, you know that they're active. So that's to look and see if there's certain parts of the brain that aren't working. They would lack glucose going there when they should. Now, again, a more advanced but way more expensive test to look at activity of the brain would be a functional MRI. And instead of looking at glucose to determine whether or not they're functioning properly, they look at blood flow. Okay, so because when parts of the brain are active, blood is flowing to those areas. So again, if you are listening to music and there's no blood flow going to the auditory cortex, you know that something's wrong. All right, so I think that is everything. I would suggest after you watch this, if you weren't here, you could look at the questions in the review book that I gave you for the AP test, the study guide, and look at the multiple choice questions, see if you can answer those. Again, the answers will give you the reason. If you got it wrong, it tells you why or the explanation for each question. If you still need clarification, make sure you write those down and you can message me or ask me before or after class this week. All right, so I hope you all have a good afternoon and I will see you all Monday.